Book 2, Chapters 18 and 19 of The Blue Lagoon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Adrian Praetzellis. The Blue Lagoon by H. de Vere Stacpoole. Chapter 18. A Fallen Idol. The next day Dick began to rebuild the house. He had fetched the staysail from the reef and rigged up a temporary tent. It was a great business cutting the canes and dragging them out in the open. Emmeline helped, whilst Hannah, seated on the grass, played with the bird that had vanished during the storm but reappeared the evening after. The child and the bird had grown fast friends. They were friendly enough even at first, but now the bird would sometimes let the tiny hands clasp him right round his body, at least as far as the hands would go. It is a rare experience for a man to hold a tame and unstruggling and unfrightened bird in his hands. Next to pressing a woman in his arms, it is the pleasantest tactile sensation he will ever experience, perhaps in life. He will feel a desire to press it to his heart, if he has such a thing. Hannah would press Koko to his little brown stomach, as if in artless admission of where his heart lay. He was an extraordinarily bright and intelligent child. He did not promise to be talkative, for, having achieved the word Dick, he rested content for a long while before advancing further into the labyrinth of language. But though he did not use his tongue, he spoke in a host of other ways. With his eyes, that were as bright as Koko's, and full of all sorts of mischief, with his hands and feet and the movements of his body. He had a way of shaking his hands before him when highly delighted, a way of expressing nearly all the shades of pleasure, and though he rarely expressed anger, when he did so he expressed it fully. He was just now passing over the frontier into Toyland. In civilization he would no doubt have been the possessor of an india-rubber dog or a woolly lamb, but there were no toys here at all. Emmeline's old doll had been left behind when they took flight from the other side of the island, and Dick, a year or so ago, on one of his expeditions, had found it lying half buried in the sand of the beach. He had brought it back now more as a curiosity than anything else, and they had kept it on the shelf in the house. The cyclone had impaled it on a tree twig near by, as if in derision, and Hannah, when it was presented to him as a plaything, flung it away from him as if in disgust. But he would play with flowers, or bright shells, or bits of coral, making vague patterns with them on the sward. All the toy lambs in the world would not have pleased him better than these things, the toys of the troglodyte children, the children of the Stone Age. To clap two oyster shells together and make a noise? What, after all, could a baby want better than that? One afternoon, when the house was beginning to take some sort of form, they ceased work and went off into the woods, Emmeline carrying the baby, and Dick taking turns with him. They were going to the valley of the idol. Since the coming of Hannah, and even before, the stone figure standing in its awful and mysterious solitude had ceased to be an object of dread to Emmeline, and had become a thing vaguely benevolent. Love had come to her under its shade, and under its shade the spirit of the child had entered into her from where, who knows, but certainly through heaven. Perhaps the thing which had been the god of some unknown people had inspired her with the instinct of religion. If so, she was his last worshipper on earth, for when they entered the valley they found him lying upon his face. Great blocks of stone lay around him. There had evidently been a landslip, a catastrophe preparing for ages, and determined perhaps by the torrential rain of the cyclone. In Ponape, Huahine, in Easter Island, you may see great idols that have been felled like this, temples slowly dissolving from sight, and terraces seemingly as solid as the hills, turning softly and subtly into shapeless mounds of stone. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19. The Expedition. Next morning the light of day filtering through the trees awakened Emmeline in the tent which they had improvised whilst the house was building. Dawn came later here than on the other side of the island which faced east. Later, and in a different manner, for there is the difference of worlds between dawn coming over a wooded hill and dawn coming over the sea. Over at the other side, sitting on the sand with the break of the reef which faced the east before you, scarcely would the east change colour before the sea line would be on fire, the sky lit up into an inimitable void of blue, and the sunlight flooding into the lagoon, the ripples of light seeming to chase the ripples of water. On this side it was different. The sky would be dark and full of stars, and the woods great spaces of velvety shadow. Then through the leaves of the artu would come a sigh, and the leaves of the breadfruit would patter, and the sound of the reef become faint. The land breeze had awakened, and in a while, as if it had blown them away, looking up, you would find the stars gone, and the sky a veil of palest blue. In this indirect approach of dawn there was something ineffably mysterious. One could see, but the things seen were indecisive and vague, just as they are in the gloaming of an English summer's day. Scarcely had Emmeline arisen when Dick woke also, and they went out on the sward, and then down to the water's edge. Dick went in for a swim, and the girl, holding the baby, stood on the bank watching him. Always after a great storm the weather of the island would become more bracing and exhilarating, and this morning the air seemed filled with the spirit of spring. Emmeline felt it, and as she watched the swimmer disporting in the water, she laughed, and held the child up to watch him. She was Fay. The breeze, filled with all sorts of sweet perfumes from the woods, blew her black hair about her shoulders, and the full light of morning, coming over the palm fronds of the woods beyond the sward, touched her and the child. Nature seemed caressing them. Dick came ashore, and then ran about to dry himself in the wind. Then he went to the dinghy and examined her, for he had determined to leave the house building for half a day and row around to the old place to see how the banana trees had fared during the storm. His anxiety about them was not to be wondered at. The island was his larder, and the bananas were a most valuable article of food. He had all the feelings of a careful housekeeper about them, and he could not rest till he had seen for himself the extent of damage, if damage there was any. He examined the boat, and then they all went back to breakfast. Living their lives, they had to use forethought. They would put away, for instance, all the shells of the coconuts they used for fuel, and you could never imagine the blazing splendour there lives in the shell of a coconut till you see it burning. Yesterday Dick, with his usual prudence, had placed a heap of sticks, all wet with the rain of the storm, to dry in the sun. As a consequence, they had plenty of fuel to make a fire with this morning. When they had finished breakfast, he got the knife to cut the bananas with, if there were any left to cut, and, taking the javelin, he went down to the boat, followed by Emmeline and the child. Dick had stepped into the boat, and was at the point of unmooring her and pushing her off, when Emmeline stopped him. "Dick." "Yes." "I will go with you." "You?" said he in astonishment. "Yes, I'm not afraid any more." It was a fact. Since the coming of the child, she had lost that dread of the other side of the island, or almost lost it. Death is a great darkness. Birth is a great light. They had intermixed in her mind. The darkness was still there, but it was no longer terrible to her, for it was infused with the light. The result was a twilight, sad but beautiful, and unpeopled with forms of fear. Years ago she had seen a mysterious door close and shut a human being out forever from the world. The sight had filled her with dread unimaginable, for she had no words for the thing, no religion or philosophy to explain it away or gloss it over. Just recently she had seen an equally mysterious door open and admit a human being, and deep down in her mind, in the place where the dreams were, the one great fact had explained and justified the other. Life had vanished into the void, but life had come from there. There was life in the void, and it was no longer terrible. Perhaps all religions were born on a day when some woman, seated upon a rock by the prehistoric sea, looked at her newborn child and recalled to mind her man who had been slain, thus closing the charm and imprisoning the idea of a future state. Emmeline, with the child in her arms, stepped into the little boat and took her seat in the stern whilst Dick pushed off. Scarcely had he put out the sculls than a new passenger arrived. It was Koko. He would often accompany them to the reef, though, strangely enough, he would never go there alone of his own accord. He made a circle or two over them, and then lit on the gunwale in the bow, and perched there, humped up, and with his long, dove-coloured tail feathers presented to the water. The oarsmen kept close inshore, and as they rounded the little cape, all gay with wild cocoa-nut, the bushes brushed the boat, and the child, excited by their colour, held out his hands to them. Emmeline stretched out her hand and broke off a branch, but it was not a branch of the wild cocoa-nut she had plucked. It was a branch of the never-wake-up berries, the berries that will cause a man to sleep should he eat of them, to sleep and dream and never wake up. "Throw them away," cried Dick, who remembered. "I will, in a minute." She was holding them up before the child, who was laughing and trying to grasp them. Then she forgot them and dropped them in the bottom of the boat, for something had struck the keel with a thud, and the water was boiling all round. There was a savage fight going on below. In the breeding season, great battles would sometimes take place in the lagoon, for fish have their jealousies just like men, love affairs, friendships. The two great forms could be dimly perceived, one in pursuit of the other, and they terrified Emmeline, who implored Dick to row on. They slipped by the pleasant shores that Emmeline had never seen before, having been sound asleep when they came past them those years ago. Just before putting off she had looked back at the beginnings of the little house under the artu tree, and as she looked at the strange glades and groves, the picture of it rose before her and seemed to call her back. It was a tiny possession, but it was home, and so little used to change was she that already a sort of homesickness was upon her. But it passed away almost as soon as it came, and she fell to wondering at the things around her, and pointing them out to the child. When they came to the place where Dick had hooked the albacore, he hung on to his oars and told her about it. It was the first time she had heard of it, a fact which shows into what state of savagery he had been lapsing. He had mentioned about the canoes, for he had to account for the javelin, but as for telling her of the incidents of the chase, He no more thought of doing so than a Red Indian would think of detailing to his squaw the incidents of a bear hunt. Contempt for women is the first law of savagery, and perhaps the last law of some old and profound philosophy. She listened, and when it came to the incident of the shark, she shuddered. "I wish I had a hook big enough to catch him with," said he, staring into the water as if in search of his enemy. "Don't think of him, Dick," said Emmeline, holding the child more tightly to her heart. "Row on." He resumed the sculls, but you could have seen from his face that he was recounting to himself the incident. When they had rounded the last promontory, and the strand and the break in the reef opened before them, Emmeline caught her breath. The place had changed in some subtle manner. Everything was there as before, yet everything seemed different. The lagoon seemed narrower, the reef nearer, the cocoa palms not nearly so tall. She was contrasting the real things with the recollection of them when seen by a child. The black speck had vanished from the reef. The storm had swept it utterly away. Dick beached the boat on the shelving sand and left Emmeline seated in the stern of it, whilst he went in search of the bananas. She would have accompanied him, but the child had fallen asleep. Hannah asleep was even a pleasanter picture than when awake. He looked like a little brown Cupid without wings, bow or arrow. He had all the grace of a curled-up feather. Sleep was always in pursuit of him, and would catch him up at the most unexpected moments. When he was at play, or indeed at any time, Emmeline would sometimes find him with a coloured shell or bit of coral that he had been playing with in his hand, fast asleep, a happy expression on his face, as if his mind were pursuing its earthly avocations on some fortunate beach in dreamland. Dick had plucked a huge breadfruit leaf and given it to her as a shelter from the sun, and she sat holding it over her and gazing straight before her over the white sunlit sands. The flight of the mind in reverie is not a direct line. To her, dreaming as she sat, came all sorts of coloured pictures recalled by the scene before her. The green water under the stern of a ship, and the word Shenandoah vaguely reflected on it. Their landing, and the little tea set spread out on the white sand. She could still see the pansies painted on the plates, and she counted in memory the lead spoons, the great stars that burned over the reef at nights, the chlorocorns and fairies, the cask by the well where the convolvulus blossomed, and the wind-blown trees seen from the summit of the hill. All these pictures drifted before her, dissolving and replacing each other as they went. There was a sadness in the contemplation of them, but pleasure too. She felt at peace with the world. All trouble seemed far behind her. It was as if the great storm that had left them unharmed had been an ambassador from the powers above to assure her of their forbearance, protection, and love. All at once she noticed that between the boat's bow and the sand there lay a broad, blue, sparkling line. The dinghy was afloat. End of chapter 19.